Okay, hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Geological Society webinar. Hopefully people out there can hear us. I think people are filtering in at the moment, so we'll just give it a couple of seconds and then we'll make a start. Yeah, I'm seeing the numbers of participants going up. So yeah, hopefully that's a good sign that people are filtering in. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We'll just give it a few more seconds while people are filtering in. Nice to watch that number of participants going steadily up. I think we've had a really nice number of people signing up to join us for today's webinar. So as I say, thank you. Thank you for coming in and joining us today. While people are filtering in, perhaps I'll just go through some points of housekeeping. Should you have any questions about accessing today's webinar via Zoom, please just drop them in the chat. Hopefully you can hear myself okay, hopefully you can see the screen, but if anybody has any accessibility issues, then do just drop a note in the chat. Chat function is there at the top of the screen. A quick word from the Society about our housekeeping. We have a duty in public interest to provide a safe, productive and welcoming environment for all participants and attendees of Society events. Attendees are asked to adhere to the event code of conduct at all times. This would have been in your invitations to today's webinar, but we will also post that in the chat. Closed captions are available today. To access those, you can click the button at the bottom of the screen. As I say, we've got an event code of conduct. We don't expect any disruptive behaviour today, but obviously the Society reserves the right to remove anyone if that's necessary. But you've been warned that we don't expect any bad behaviour. And of course, the Society seeks to create and promote an inclusive culture through our events and all of our activities. There is an inclusivity protocol, and again, we'll share that with you in the chat. So hopefully most people are now in and connected. Thank you again, as I say, for joining today's Geological Society webinar. Our agenda looks like this. The focus today is on this wonderfully titled paper that's been published recently in the Society's journal, Earth Science, Systems and Society. We are joined today presenting by the authors of this paper, as well as the editor-in-chief of Earth Science, Systems and Society, Catherine Goodenough. Speakers will be able to introduce themselves as things progress, so we won't go around and do that just now. As I say, we've got the chat function and the Q&A functions switched on. If you do have questions for any of the speakers, please use the Q&A function and we'll pick those up there. Otherwise, any general comments can be shared using the chat function. So, without any further ado, we've got about an hour. We've got a bit to get through. As I say, we should have some time at the end for questions and answers. And we're going to kick off with an introduction to Earth Science, Systems and Society, or ES3, as we call it for short. Now, this is a journal that the Society launched in 2021. And one of our key goals in launching that journal is in providing a sustainable and compliant route to open access publishing with the Society and for the community. And to give a bit of a brief introduction to the journal, I'm going to hand over to the journal's editor-in-chief, Catherine Goodenough. Catherine.
Thanks very much, David, and welcome to everybody who's here. So I'm Catherine Goodenough. I'm from the British Geological Survey, and as David has said, I'm Chief Editor for Earth Science Systems and Society, or as we say, ES Cubed. And ES Cubed is the Geological Society's fully open access journal. And I work with David and the Geological Society team, with our publishing partners at Frontiers, and with the editorial board of ES Cubed to put the journal together. And our editorial board is very diverse and very international. We always welcome interest. If anyone is interested in joining the editorial board, please do feel free to contact us. Now, ES Cubed has a fairly wide remit, but the real aim, as you can see from the title, is to publish research that addresses those areas where geoscience can really tackle some of society's grandest challenges. And in particular, we're very interested in multidisciplinary research. And of course, I think we all know that the geosciences are hugely important right now in addressing all of those challenges that we're facing around the world. Decarbonisation, for example, dealing with climate change, the energy transition, hazards, issues around growing populations. So many of these things are so important. And that's why public perception of the geosciences is also really important. And for that reason, at ES Cubed, we're really pleased to be involved with this group of authors who've published the fantastic paper that you're about to hear about now. Because I think this is a really important subject. If we can't convince people or demonstrate to people that geology really is important, then that's going to create those challenges that are going to be even more significant in the future. So I'm going to hand back to David, and I'd like to welcome the authors and say thanks very much for publishing with ES Cubed.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And as Catherine says, the focus really of today's session is on this wonderful paper, and we'll hand over to the authors in just a second. But if anybody does have any queries about the journal, ES Cubed, whether that's submitting a paper or, as Catherine says, participating as a reviewer or on the journal's editorial board, here are the contact email addresses for the journal, and we'd really love to hear from you. So yeah, please do get in touch. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to our team of authors today and to Steve to kick things off. As I say, there will be a presentation of the paper, and then there should be an opportunity to ask some questions a bit later on. So Steve, I wonder if I can pass to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'll just start sharing my screen. So hopefully everyone can see the slides okay there. So yeah, there's not a huge amount of time, to be quite honest, to go through an entire paper. So to try and distill an entire paper down into sort of half an hour, so we've got some time for Q&A at the end, is quite the task. So the plan for today is to really quite, whiz straight through the methods and things that we put together for this paper, and just have a look at some of the larger conclusions and some of our perhaps recommendations. So hopefully there's a good chunk of time at the end for everybody to ask some questions. So the paper is called "You Just Look at Rocks and Have Beards: Perceptions of Geology Diversity and Inclusive Practice." It's a qualitative paper, so it's a little bit different to a lot of the papers that most geologists are perhaps used to, or that we're trained perhaps to put together work on and read. And so we did write it in a way that we've tried to write it in a way that's very, very accessible to individuals that haven't necessarily been taught or trained or have a background in qualitative methods. So hopefully if you are interested, go away and have a look. As Catherine pointed out, it's an open access journal, so it's freely available to anyone that's interested. You might have noticed Brad Pitt's lurking on the first slide. I don't often get confused with Brad Pitt. He's here just to set the scene. So he's there. It's one of the most recent Hollywood embodiments of a geologist, essentially. And Brad Pitt plays a character called Rusty, who tries to essentially is a seismologist or a geologist looking at earthquakes. And he turns up in a corporate environment, into a big multi-million-pound hotel in a corporate environment, dressed in all of his outdoors gear with a stick-on beard, and just sort of highlights a typical or stereotypical view of geologists by the wider world. We'll go through the author team in a bit more detail when we get to the Q&A session. Not everybody could make it today, but the majority of us are here. And I'd just like to suppose highlight the final author on the list there, Chris King. Many people will know Chris King from the world of geology. Chris passed away whilst we were doing this this particular project, but he helped out a great deal at the start, and was hugely enthusiastic about the project. And he helped put us in contact with some really important people and groups. So that we've got a bit of an acknowledgement to Chris at the end of the paper as well. But the rest of us, those that can make it, will be answering questions towards the end. I'd also just like to point out at this point that during some of the dissemination, some people think that this is a Geological Society sort of backed project, or that it was funded in some way by the Geological Society. It wasn't. It was. I'll get in a minute to how we came together and as a group to put this together, but we weren't in any way funded by the Geological Society. We did have a little bit of funding from different areas to get some illustrations put together, but most of this was essentially done as free research. So it isn't a Geological Society, if you like, backed or funded project. We have published it in ES3. So yeah, I saw some confusion around that in some of the dissemination, I think. So what we're going to explore really quickly, as I've already pointed out, we're going to have a look importantly at the sort of survey setup. So as this is based on data that's come from a survey, we're going to have a little look at how we set up the survey and who it was aimed at, and what we were sort of looking at getting data around. Then we'll go into a couple of the perceptions of geology that we picked out from here. We'll get you to have a little think perhaps about the possible causes of these perceptions, but we don't actually have the answers necessarily for all of this. And then we'll have a little look at some of the responses, and particularly pick out some differences between the two major groups of respondents, and I'll go into those in a little bit as well. And then finally, we've just got a couple of what we think are our recommendations, at least, of where we could go from here as essentially a subject or a discipline. But I should point out that we don't have all the answers. We would never claim to have all the answers. Really, all we're doing with this particular project is answering a single question, and I'll explore that in a second. So how did this actually start? Why have we done this? Strangely enough, it started on Twitter, or X, or whatever you want to call it now. And it happened around a time, and I can't remember which department it was, but essentially a geology course got closed down. And this happened just before COVID, and there was a big discussion on Twitter about what is going on with geology, why are our numbers falling, for example, and why a course is being closed down, or whole departments in some cases being closed down. And there was a huge number of reasons sort of given for this. We all know that the numbers are falling. So I've got some infographics here, some graphs from around the world in this case, just to give you an idea. So the top left is Spain, the top right is Australia, and the bottom is A-level in the UK. And you can see in all of them over the recent years, over the last 10 so years, at least the numbers of students taking the subject have dropped quite significantly. And if you actually look further back, in some cases in some of the other countries, so Spain, for example, only goes back to 2000 there, but they've got a very similar story to the advanced levels, the A levels in geology in the UK that you can see at the bottom. So a general drop in numbers of students studying the subject. Now you can also see in the top right-hand one from Australia that they've tried to link it in this case to basically expenditure, so to employability in particular areas. So in this case, it was mineral exploration, and they've tried to link it to the idea that the more mineral exploration that's going on, the more students that study geology. And we were getting lots of these sorts of ideas in this Twitter discussion, and people were I think a lot of the time with quite a high degree of authority saying this is the reason why student numbers are dropping in the geosciences. So a lot of the time we were getting it linked to things like the economics and the job market. A lot of the time it was linked to the idea that there's no geology pre-university, so students don't study geology, for example, at A-level, or they don't have even the option to study it perhaps at A-level. Employment opportunities came up time and time again, so people saying, perhaps there's no jobs out there, so students aren't studying it for those reasons. And then the final reason that came up quite a lot was the idea that historically, and I suppose in the present, geology is very tightly associated with oil and gas and mining. Of course, geology is always going to be associated with the extractive industries, but it was the destructive practices that some of these industries have been responsible for that were putting particularly a younger generation that are very much more perhaps environmentally aware off studying the subject. So people were associating geology with destructive practice, essentially. And then all of these reasons were coming through, and the thing that linked them all was that the blame was always external to geology as a discipline. So it was always, oh, it's because of the pre-university curriculum, or it's because of the economy, or it's because of destructive practices of industry, and not what we're doing as a subject. And we sort of looked at these answers that were coming through and the way that they were being sort of put forwards. And we know that some of them just aren't true. So, for example, poor employment opportunities, particularly in the UK at the moment, opportunities for geoscientists are absolutely amazing. Geoscientists are on the UK government's wanted list. So if you are external to the UK and you want to migrate into the country, being a geologist, for example, will nab you a job. So we know that those opportunities are there. We also know, for example, that students do get taught geology in the curriculum pre-university. So perhaps it's not solely down to A-levels. And the final one here that we sort of questioned quite strongly was this idea that it was very strongly linked to the economy and, for example, boom and bust within the oil industry. Now, I don't know what's going on with hiring in the North Sea, gas and oil, for example. So I don't think a 16-year-old making their decisions for A-level and then university are going to know those sorts of specifics about the economy and the jobs available in that particular industry. So we sat there and we thought, you know what, there's actually not a huge amount of evidence here at all. And I also sat there and thought, in my particular, where I'm from Keele University, by the way, and at Keele we've got a great forensic science department, well, the part of a department, and the numbers there are huge. And I sat there thinking, a lot of the reasons being given here would also affect forensic science. So forensic science is a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary degree, just like geology. But nobody does any forensic science named as forensic science in the curriculum in the UK pre-university. Yet forensic science numbers are absolutely skyrocketing. And in fact, they were skyrocketing to such an extent that the government commissioned a report into what is going on. Why are so many students taking forensic science? Because I think very naively, the government were worried that less or fewer students were doing what they called the core sciences of biology, chemistry, and physics. So they were getting really worried that perhaps there wouldn't be enough scientists graduating with a degree. But I think they were, I say, a little bit naive in that, because of course if you do a forensic science degree, you're actually getting a really good interdisciplinary degree where you cover lots of different types of science as well. But anyway, this report was commissioned and it was produced, and it makes a really, really nice comparison for geology, because if you look at both subjects, they're both quite similar. Both are interdisciplinary. Both allow students to study science in general. So you can do a bit of biology, you can do a bit of physics, a bit of chemistry. You do some work with society, with humans. There's surveying in there. So they are quite similar in terms of discipline area. But interestingly, one has an incredibly high student number, which is forensic science, but no jobs whatsoever. The government essentially shut down a lot of the forensic science labs. So there's a very, very low vocational opportunity there. And the other, geology, has low numbers, but actually has a high vocational opportunity potentially. So there are, we know, demand for geologists and geoscientists at the moment. So when we were having this sort of discussion on Twitter, I was sat there thinking and looking at sort of forensic science as a really nice comparison for geology in this particular case. And we sat there and thought, well, there's been this report for forensic science. What about geology? Why is there no evidence base for geology? And suddenly realized that essentially nobody had ever bothered to do a study on this particular issue. There'd been plenty of, I suppose, opinion pieces, maybe. Opinion's probably not the right word, but sort of review in sort of magazines and things like that of people sort of discussing why the numbers might be going down and showing that the numbers were going down. But nobody had actually bothered to sit there and ask, what do people think of geology and why do people study it or not study it? So we came together as a little team. I said we can introduce some of the team when it comes to Q&A. And this was quite an interesting way of actually collaborating. I've really, really enjoyed this project. So I essentially just said on Twitter, who fancies doing something about this and actually putting together a project and looking into some of these issues. I went and I emailed Chris King separately and just sort of said, Chris, has got this idea, because I've been working with Chris a little bit on some things in EGU, for example. And he was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do this. And really, really interestingly, I got quite a few emails and messages from quite a few male geologists saying, yeah, it's a great idea, but not wanting to help out. And I think this is a really, really interesting part of geology at the moment, that if you look at work like this, it is usually done by women and females. And if you look at our team, all of these individuals came together and said, yes, we want to do something about this. What can we do? How can we help? I didn't get a single male geologist coming forward and saying, yeah, I want to help out with this. I think this is a great idea. All I got was, yeah, I think that's a good idea. You should do something about this. Just an interesting point, not really to do with this paper, but I think that's worth pointing out at this point. So on to our surveys. We got together as a group and decided we needed to obviously come up with a rigorous survey and figure out some certain points. And what we focused on is UK geologists, or indeed individuals who had studied in the UK at some point. And the reason that we chose the UK was purely because that's where we're all based at the moment, and because it's where we feel we perhaps had the most influence on. I think if we opened this up to worldwide, which we certainly could have done, it wouldn't have been difficult because it was disseminated digitally. We would have got a huge number of respondents potentially, but we wouldn't have necessarily been able to filter them out very well. So we stuck with the UK because we knew we had a good idea of the education system in the UK. We have a good idea of things like employability in the UK. We have a good idea of obviously students at university, A levels, etc., and what they're sort of going through. And so we wanted to main areas that we looked at were who had not studied geology and why they chose not to study it. And we knew that in some cases it would be the availability, but other cases it might be something else. We particularly wanted to know from those who didn't study it a specific reason why. It might just be that they'd never considered it. It might be that they'd never heard of the subject. It might be that they got a specific reason to do so. So we wanted to figure out if that was true or not. And what was really important was that we wanted to identify perceptions of the subject. So what do people think about geology? And there we thought it was really important to get perceptions of both people that have studied geology and those that haven't studied geology, and make a little bit of a comparison between the two. And then finally, to see if we could pull out any identity and identify any barriers to studying geology itself. And again, as a team, we already knew that there are potential barriers. We know that there are barriers to our students, for example, at undergraduate courses in university. So we guessed that some of these barriers might be identified by participants. But what we were interested in was whether people that hadn't studied geology also perceive those same barriers. So whether people that hadn't studied geology see the same barriers that we see as individuals within, if you like, the discipline already. Now, the survey, really important because, as I said, this is a qualitative study. So learning what our sort of survey was is really, really important. So being open about how we disseminate and stuff is quite important. It was an mostly open text answer survey. So there were quite a few questions and they were asking people their opinions, and they could answer in sentences, paragraphs, whatever they wanted to. And we came up with quite a lot of questions. I think, again, it's quite naive. A lot of this is the first time many of us were working on sort of qualitative projects, or some of the first qualitative projects perhaps we've worked on. And I think quite naively, we asked quite a few questions and we got a huge amount of data back. And of course, this went through an ethical committee, and we got favourable ethical consideration from the institution ethics committee for it. And this survey was disseminated during COVID. So I think that helped us a little bit because everybody at that time was sort of living digitally, weren't they? So everyone was online, working sort of online at home, etc. And we shared it originally through social media. So in that point, we didn't actually know where it went. So it's an idea called snowball surveying. So you send that out and ask people to also send out the survey, and they do that, and it just gets sent out further and further and further. But we also shared it to specific groups that we would like, we wanted answers from. So these included groups like ESTA, for example, and the Geological Society we sent it to. There's a big list of sort of societies related to geology and related to individuals that we thought might give or contribute to the data. And we received over 500. We got 559 responses, which equated to over 8,000 individual free text answers, which is an absolutely enormous number. So most studies like this won't even attempt to try and get numbers like that. Again, perhaps a little bit naive that we went really heavy with the data. What it does mean, A, it took a huge amount of time to actually go through the data, but B, we know that it's really, really rigorous. And we do thank everybody that did respond to that survey and participate. I think in the future, fewer responses, but perhaps more sort of rigorous, perhaps interview questions or something might be a good way forward, though. And the survey itself was designed so it was 2 surveys in one. So essentially, the first question that you were asked was, have you ever studied geology, for example, in the UK system? And if you answered yes, you'd go onto one side of the survey, and if you answered no, you'd be sort of shot off onto the other half of the survey. So there were very, very slightly different wordings to some of the questions for people that had studied geology or hadn't studied geology. And by studied geology, we asked for it to be essentially a named geology qualification, if you like. So it could have been geology GCSE, geology A level, or geoscience or something similar, or geology, geoscience, etc. at university. We didn't take the geology that, for example, is in the primary school curriculum to mean studying geology. So it had to be a named, if you like, qualification that you could get at the end of that study. And the main questions that we asked were essentially a bit of course, personal information. And we thought when we were starting this study that there were going to be very, very distinct groups that felt very, very differently about geology. And a spoiler for when we get to the results, there wasn't particularly massive differences between groups. There are some very, very predominant perceptions about geology that are pretty much widespread. We wanted to know the experiences of studying geology. So how have they studied it? Where have they studied it? Why or why did they not study it, for example? Even, we had lots of people talking about if it had been available, they might have studied it, for example, at A level, but it wasn't, and all those sorts of questions and answers within there. And then the big part that makes up the most of this paper is the perceptions of geology. So we asked people things like, what is geology? And asked them their free text answer on that. And then finally, we also asked, there's a section on subject relevance. And we asked in this particular part, what, if you like, sub-subjects or sub-disciplines people thought fit best with the description of geology or geoscience. And in the end, we didn't actually use any of that data, or we haven't used any of that data yet. We could do. There's certain things we can do in the future, perhaps with that data, but we didn't incorporate that within the final project. It didn't just sort of add anything to the perceptions piece that we finally put together. Now this bit is very quick. I'll go over this. It's explained a little bit more in the paper, but again, because it's qualitative, it's very, very important that you understand the framework essentially that we approach this work with. And the majority of the work that we did was essentially reflexive thematic analysis. So you can see here that the two highlighted approaches, grounded theory and reflexive thematic analysis, both of them are very, very similar in that they allow you to approach data and essentially look for patterns and look for sort of common ideas, common concepts that you find in that data, and in the end you theme them. So you put those ideas together for anything that might be telling a story about the data that you have and what those patterns that you identify might mean within that particular data. It's also important that other people, if other people did this project, they might approach it in a different way, and some people might come up with slightly different themes. But if they follow the ideas of grounded theory and reflective thematic analysis, they should come out with generally the same ideas and the same themes here. Also, quite important to point out is that both of these approaches you come at them essentially with known preconceptions. So it's okay to have preconceptions when you come at the data, as long as you can recognize those preconceptions and then look at the data in a non-biased way, or as non-biased as you can possibly get, and then build in perhaps your preconceptions at a later state to say if you're right or wrong in some cases. So being biased to something or having a preconception doesn't stop you doing this sort of work. It's the recognition that you might have those biases, for example, that allows you to sort of go forward with the work. So on to some of the results, and I said we don't really have a huge amount of time to go through this today, but so what I've tried to do is just pick out some of the sort of highlights, I suppose, of the project. And just to highlight really that the major differences between the two groups, or the respondents, were the two groups, obviously, as you might expect, those that had studied geology and those who hadn't studied geology see the subject or the discipline in a very, very different way. So the difference in perceptions between those two groups were pretty huge, and that was one of the only few differences that we found between the respondents, and that one wasn't a surprise to us at all, to be quite honest. But what was a surprise was that those who had studied geology really, really struggle to describe the discipline or the subject. So there were very, very few descriptions of, for example, what is geology that were the same. And quite often we had quite vague responses to things like, oh, it's too broad to explain, or there's too much to fit into an answer in this particular question. And quite often, that sort of gave us the sense that perhaps people aren't confident in actually communicating their science. So we're not confident in perhaps saying what geology is about, and what we go about doing. What was quite nice that those who study geology do emphasize that it's about studying the earth a little bit more than studying rocks. And I've highlighted that because those that didn't study geology say rocks quite a lot. So the answer, the study of rocks, was incredibly common throughout the answers for those. So people percepting geology think that it's just studying rocks. Those that do study geology see that it is, of course, looking at the earth, and what the earth can sort of tell you a little bit more about the sort of the planet and processes that bring us to where we are today and where we might be in the future. And really, really nicely was highlighted afterwards in separate questions by people that had studied geology, is the way that the subject fundamentally changes the way you look at the world. By studying geology, you literally look at the world in a completely different manner, and you'll drive around or you'll walk around and you'll see things, and you'll start to see processes, you'll start to see tectonic processes, you'll start to see processes that take millions of years sort of going through your head and working through your head. And then it is a fundamentally it transforms the way that you actually see the world and see life in some cases. And so they were really highlighting this fundamental shift in how they approach life and the world because they had studied geology. That wasn't mentioned, of course, at all by those that hadn't studied the subject at all. The other thing that was really nicely picked out by geologists or people that studied geology was how varied the subject was. So a lot of the time people say, oh, it's too vague, it's too big to actually sum up what a geologist does. And then they'd go into, but geologists can do this and do that, and I do this and I do that. And they were describing really, really interdisciplinary science. Lots of people were explaining perhaps how they interact with different groups of people. So it's outside of geology. So they might be, for example, interacting with councils or with governmental agencies like the Environment Agency and groups like that. There were loads of people suggesting the jobs that they'd got from geology, so not just purely extraction and not just purely oil, gas, mining, for example. There were a huge number of jobs that people were sort of saying that they can go into and you can do. And the other thing that was pointed out a lot is the idea that people who've studied geology were recognizing that it's a very, very wide study of field in terms of what you can do as well. So you could work at a desk, you can work in remote sensing, you can go out on a rig if you want to, you can go out into the field if you want to, you can spend your time looking at literature if you want to. And the fact that it was a very, very, I suppose, diverse in its ways that you can actually study the subject itself. Again, those who had studied the subject also highlighted a huge number of EDI issues, and this is the only other place where we had a big difference between our participants and who said what. And again, it was only white women and female participants in particular that were really, really highlighting EDI issues commonly. Again, it was perhaps not a massive surprise in some cases, but again, I think it does show a lot about our discipline, and perhaps where some of the labor is coming from, let's say, in making it a much more inclusive and accessible discipline. And a lot of these were actually based on experiences. And we did actually have quite a lot of data that was a little bit eye-opening actually in some cases, and quite depressing in some of the experiences that certain people had as they were studying geology and whilst they were studying geology. A lot of that, we didn't put any of those quotes, for example, in the paper itself, but just to highlight, there were some really quite significant experiences shared by participants that really highlighted some of these issues that we can go into in a little bit. Fieldwork was highlighted, I suppose, by everybody, particularly its cost, and this was highlighted by geologists, but also by non-geologists in some cases. They were saying they didn't want to get into the subject because they knew it was going to cost them a lot more money than studying another subject, for example. So the cost was definitely there. But along that, there was also quite a strong highlighting of things like what we've sort of called the lad culture and drinking culture around fieldwork in particular, and people feeling essentially unsafe in some of those spaces when they were expected to go out into field work and spend their time in an environment that wasn't particularly safe or encouraging either for them. And then a big old one, really, really important one, and a really quite, again, some of this is quite depressing and quite sad. that the geology is essentially perceived as being old, stale, and pale. And it's very, very easy to say that, and people might be thinking, oh, it probably came up once or twice. This came up a lot. So out of the 559 responses that we got, the idea that geologists are all old white men that have no new ideas and essentially shuffle around collecting rocks was a really prevalent perception of what geology is and who does geology. These little illustrations, I've used them because they're from the illustrations that we got done for the paper, so I thought we'd best use them in the talks about the paper as well. And these really interestingly, so we wrote the paper and obviously went into the review process, and one of the thing that reviewers agreed on was that some illustrations would look really good. So what we did was we commissioned an illustration. And when the artist agreed to do it was Raquel from a company called More Than Minutes. She actually asked, what do you want me to draw here? And we went back and said, actually, if possible, we'd like you to read our paper and we want you to draw what you actually get from the paper. So we didn't have a huge amount of input into what was drawn. When they came back, we obviously corrected a few little bits and asked for some bits to be moved around. But the drawings that we got were essentially from a non-geologist reading our paper and taking the sort of data, if you like, and the findings from there, which was really pleasing to us because Raquel basically came back with exactly what we were trying to say. And these particular images come from the section of the paper of essentially non-geologists and what they think of the subject. And the first one is, and again, it's as a geologist, it's really sad to hear, is that non-geologists think geology is boring. And again, that the word boring turns up 121 times in our data. It's a really strong perception of the subject. It is boring. People don't see what geologists do. They think geologists essentially go out and collect and curate rocks. They think when we go on field work, we just go and find a fancy rock somewhere and add it to our collection, essentially. That is essentially the idea of perhaps what geologists do for non-geologists. They don't understand perhaps the interdisciplinarity of the subject, and there's certainly are missing is the sort of storytelling part. So the idea of millions of years of Earth history, hundreds of millions of years of Earth history, thousands of millions of years of Earth history, all coming together. And by looking at a rock and by studying a rock, using a rock as a tool, you can start to unpick some of that and actually figure out what's happened on this planet in the past, how have we got to where we are, and what might happen in the future. But it's boring is a massive perception that's out there. Really interestingly, also with perceptions like it's niche. So the idea that geology was a really specific science. And again, we can see from descriptions from people that have done geology, we know it's not niche at all. We know it's actually a very broad subject and allows you to almost pick and mix your interests and focus on if you like, a sub part of the discipline that you were sort of interested in. The idea that it's white male dominated came up quite a lot. The idea again that traveling is expensive, and this particularly came through from students that they didn't study the subject because they felt that fieldwork was such a strong component or large component of it, is that they couldn't afford to do that field work as part of the degree, and they could go and do another degree, let's say in chemistry, and they'd have zero additional costs, for example, on top of their degree. So the additional costs associated with traveling and equipment was off-putting for certain people. Linked to that was the idea that geology, you have to be outdoorsy for geology. So the idea that you have to be an outdoors person, that you have to go, you like hiking and all those sorts of things, and that if you don't like hiking, you don't like field work, that geology isn't for you. And again, that is completely opposite to what a lot of the geologists are obviously telling us, saying, you can go outdoors and do field work, but you could also quite happily sit in a lab and do really important and really good geology in a lab, for example. And what was also clear from a lot of the responses, and this the top two images here, is that loads of people love geology when they're young. There were so many people that were telling us they love dinosaurs, they love volcanoes, they love earthquakes, they like collecting gems or whatever it might be as part of their childhood. And then they basically get that just beaten out of them in some way, shape or form, and then think geology doesn't necessarily investigate those areas. And it's all about rocks when you get to sort of A-level and geology and university, for example. And then finally, just again, left at the bottom here is the idea about employment prospects. That came out quite a lot from non-geologists as well. Be very interesting to see what careers advice looks like in school and colleges, I think, at the moment. But it was very clear that employment was not being highlighted from the geoscience. So those are some of the perceptions. And I said what we did is in this thematic analysis, we put them together with themes, and we've not got a huge amount of time, so I will whiz through these themes. And again, in the paper, we explain what these themes mean, where the data comes from to put them together, and what they actually sort of mean for the subject. But essentially, we've got 4 themes that came through from our data. The first theme is we really struggle to communicate what is geology. So we struggle to define it. People that haven't done geology basically don't know. They think it's just rocks. So there is a really big communication issue here between what geology actually is and what we do as geologists, and what people see geologists as doing, and what geology is. And a lot of this we think is potentially because missing all of the links that we know are so important. So Catherine at the start emphasised, for example, decarbonisation and the grand challenges that society have. Very few people, I think, actually associate geology with those grand challenges. So, for example, very, very few people, I think, associate let's say the shift to net zero and the shift to electric cars or electric batteries with the idea that extraction is still going to have to happen, and lithium is going to have to be found from somewhere and extracted from somewhere, for example, and it will be the role of future geologists to help initiate those sorts of processes. So there's a massive disconnect between geology as a subject, people, society, and particularly sustainability and policy. So there wasn't a single geologist even that mentioned, for example, that they work with policy, or that they aspire, for example, to be working and making policy in the future. In this theme, there was also a little bit of chat about whether geology should be renamed as earth science. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. It's a very, very difficult one, I think, with that one. And until you know what people think about earth science, I think it would be a very, very difficult thing to do, to suggest, for example, that geology changes to geoscience or earth science, or even if they are the same thing. In my opinion, for example, in my perception, earth science is a much broader subject. So in my bachelor's degree, I studied a program called Earth System Science, and it was way broader than the geology program, for example. So I think there are probably differences there, but it is something, the name is very, very important. So there's something to consider there. The second theme, as a geologist, probably unsurprising for lots of people that have spoken to friends or work colleagues outside of geology and things like that, and they say, oh, well, you're looking at rocks, are you, or what you're doing, or you're going to see some rocks, or something along those lines. The idea that geology is boring, but this is such a huge issue. It's a massive problem that we've got to look at and somehow solve. The idea that you go out with a hammer, and Raquel's drawing here of a geologist really summed up, I think, the perception of geologists from this data, is that you'd basically walk up to an outcrop, hit it with a hammer, and add it to your collection. And that is what a geologist sort of does. We suggest perhaps that really highlighting the interdisciplinary approach from geology could be quite important. So again, we see that it works for forensic science, and forensic science students are doing it because it's interdisciplinary. Geology is, if anything, the interdisciplinary subject, to be quite honest. So perhaps we need to lean into that a little bit more, for example. Employability and destructive practices came through very, very strongly. So the idea that either people don't perhaps understand where you can get a job with a geology degree or geology training, and that doesn't, of course, have to be in the geology industry. We have huge amount of transferable skills as geologists and geoscientists, for example. So perhaps there's a misunderstanding about what you can do with a geology degree. But I think there's also, again, a huge amount of work for geologists, and it is our responsibility to actually acknowledge, and resolve a lot of the destructive practice that goes on through geological practices, so through geological industry. And of course, it's not necessarily directly responsible for that. I've got nothing to do with a large mining company or something and the destructive practices, but we can, for example, teach students about things like conservation, whether that's geoconservation, bioconservation, ecology. We can teach students about land ownership. We can teach them about what land and what rocks mean to other cultures and other peoples. So we can start to reconcile some of this stuff as people that are outside of that sphere as well. But definitely, we need to start thinking again in terms of what are the future jobs for geologists. And again, we know a lot of this is extraction, and where is the extraction sort of industry going to go, but also where do geologists sit when, for example, policy is made or planning for towns or for expansions, for example, is actually done. So there's a huge amount that could be done there within that sort of employability bracket as well. And our final theme, and again, I know I'm whizzing through these, but the final theme is essentially diversity and inclusion. Now, that there was definitely, this was highlighted far more by people that have done geology than those that hadn't done geology. And again, that's perhaps not surprising, because those people that hadn't done geology haven't actually experienced a lot of the inclusivity issues, for example, within the subject. Diversity was definitely seen by everybody. So the fact that the geology is perceived to be old, male and stale was seen across the board. The inclusive issues were actually highlighted far more often by geologists themselves. And again, some of the stories and some of the data that we had was really eye-opening, and it does show there is a lot that we need to do and a lot we can do to make our subject much more accessible. Nobody is suggesting, for example, that we don't do field work. I never suggest that people, field work can be, again, one of those sort of revolutionary events in your life, and sort of really click with how you understand the subject and things like that. So nobody would ever suggest that we don't do field work, but the way we do field work does need to perhaps be looked at to make sure that it is accessible for anybody that wants to do that field work. So we've gone through a lot of perceptions here, and just to have a little think here for yourselves, where you think these perceptions might actually come from. In our opinion, there's a huge variety of places these come from. It comes from us, so it comes from us as geologists. It comes from us as academics or as teachers, for example, and we can also help change those perceptions. They also probably come from the media quite strongly. So one of the reasons, again, for forensic science being popular was CSI Miami. Perhaps we need a CSI Geology or something, I don't know, some popular media outlet for geology, at least. But those perceptions are really quite heavily embedded in people's minds. So they're clearly coming from a variety of different places. And again, it's up to us and our responsibility to sort of try and change those. And then the recommendations, I'll really whiz through those, so there is some time for some Q&A. Our main recommendations are essentially: geology needs to embrace its interdisciplinarity, and it really needs to embrace the fact that it impacts people, it impacts society, it impacts strongly on things like conservation, and really impacts strongly on things like sustainability and the sort of travel to sort of net zero as well. And so we really need to embrace that and shout about how geology is important for this, and how we can help, and how geologists are important for the future. Something else we think could be really important is the idea of sort of storytelling and how we approach geology communication. So again, rather than just, I don't know, classifying rocks as an outreach event, why not go into it with a sort of a story to tell of Earth's history and the beauty, essentially, of studying rocks to tell you about the Earth and what's happened through time. And then finally, our recommendation is essentially that the geological community needs to take responsibility for this. So as an author team, we have also seen some suggestions in the past, for example, that we should be recommending how to fix some of these things. And it's our responsibility to, for example, say how fieldwork could be more accessible. No, it's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is, of course, part of this, but this paper is just to highlight these issues. Of course, we want to work for it, but the responsibility is the geological community as a whole, and everybody needs to get on board, I'm afraid, with this to create a much more modern, inclusive and respected discipline. And one of the ways to do that, for example, is this idea of grand challenges and looking at environmental, for example, and human rights. And sorry, that one was quite rushed, but I know that we are running out of time almost. And just to give you an idea of what we're essentially up against, this is a direct quote now from the study. So geology is still a dusty old subject with dusty old people and dusty old views. So to really emphasize this idea that it's all our responsibilities to try and change these perceptions, I'll leave you with that quote. It is up to all of us to try and change this as a perception of the subject that we all basically love and really see the importance of for the future. So I'll be quiet now and see what we've got in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much for that. That was breathless run through what is a very detailed paper and lots to cover, and it's clearly stimulated some questions here. So I think we can dive straight in with the Q&A. What I'll do is I'll moderate and perhaps read out some of the questions, and if any of the authors who are with us have a particular interest in answering, if you wouldn't mind switching on your camera or throwing up a hand or just jumping in. We've got one here about how the author group targeted the group for the survey who didn't study geology. So social media was mentioned as a way of reaching out to people. Were the authors able to reach people who hadn't considered geology as an option, but found it interesting. Is there anyone on the author team who might like to take that one? Steve?
Yeah,
your
so,
hand's
so
gone
really
straight up.
quickly, I suppose the breakdown of our nearly 600 respondents was about 200 respondents were non-geologists. And so obviously that's a third of the entire respondent range, but that's still 200 voices from non-geology that were giving us the data for those that hadn't done a geology degree or something at some particular point in their life. So still really quite considerable, good number. We weren't surprised that there were fewer of them than people that had done geology because of who was sharing it. So because it was coming out from our networks, of course, there's going to be more people that have done geology than the normal population. But to have a third of them, we were really pleased with that. And to have 200 people that had never studied geology was ultimately quite pleasing to have engage with our surveys.
Thanks, Steve. We've got a number of the authors joining us today. We've got Natasha and Steve, both of whom have been active in the Q&A chat already. We've also got Sarah and Rimat, and we'll move on to some more questions. And as I say, if any of the authors in particular would like to pick these up, do just throw up a hand. There's a question here about how the idea that geology is just rocks is being perpetrated, and making the point about education of the public and of teachers. Natasha, your hand's gone straight up, so I might throw to you on this one, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'm quite interested in this one because my daughter is currently in primary school and they've just had their geology being taught to them in their curriculum. And actually it's very much sold as rocks. Rocks and fossils. Theirs at their school was called Rocks, Relics and Rumbles. And what was interesting is that the kids were really engaged. They invited me to go along because they knew I'm a geologist. And I gave a talk that was very much not about rocks. So really about all the different aspects of geoscience, all the different careers. But it was really clear that the kids were really engaged with this idea of rocks and gems and crystals, and they're still very excited at that age about the sparkly, shiny things. So I guess what's a more interesting question is, what then happens? I think that a lot of kids, anyone who's got children will probably have been pebble hunting along a beach and seen the excitement that kids can have about the natural world and about the physicality of the natural world. But I think what our study shows here is that that doesn't continue necessarily in a positive way. So I guess it's not so much who's perpetuating the idea of rocks and geology, it's more where are we losing the bigger picture of those applied solutions, and where are we losing that excitement of the natural world? I don't know if any of the other authors want to come in, but yeah, I just thought I'd give that kind of experience of like the younger primary school curriculum.
Steve, you've got a hand up as
Yeah,
well.
I've done exactly the same as Natasha. So I've got my kids are going through exactly that same stage at school, and the curriculum around these rocks focuses on things like porosity. So it's teaching a kid that chalk is porous, but basalt is hard. And you sort of think, well, where's that actually leading to, and what's that going to teach? What does that teach them? So that there is a little bit of an issue with what's in the curriculum, but as Natasha said, it's completely lost. And they do their rocks at that stage, and then that sort of finishes until they get then to secondary school. And all these, they're learning about how the Earth formed, but it's never pointed out that that is geology essentially. So the study of the Earth is what geologists do. So it's a very, very mixed, I think, issue, to be quite honest. Of, as Natasha said, we just lose it somewhere. It just doesn't get pointed out that it's geology at some point, and people just think that the rocks is the ultimate aim of geology.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, and we've got some comments in the chat as well about how important education is here, and I'm sure members of the Society's education team would absolutely echo those points and those answers that have been given there. There's an interesting question come in about high-profile rock stars within geology, and perhaps kind of public figures who are out there representing the discipline. The question also cites obviously Brian Cox and his impact on sort of physics and the sciences. Is there anyone that people feel is representing the geologists, or how important do people feel this is as a as something within society to draw attention to the discipline, perhaps? Any of the panelists have any comments on that? Perhaps not. Sarah.
I'll just say really quickly, I mean, aren't the kids on like TikTok? Yeah, I'm dating myself here, but yeah, I just I don't have a strong sense of where those rock stars would need to be even in order to reach those voices. I don't know if it's the same programs that we were thinking about when we were growing up and getting interested in this years ago.
I think Sarah raises a really good point. I think that everyone's been aware of kind of the Attenborough effect for biology and ecology. And I guess there is an element of, you know, the parents watching those things and then engaging their children in those subjects. But I think that Sarah raises a really important point that I think we haven't got a good handle on how to influence young people around geology. So where should the influences be and how effective is that? I know that there are people out there with very high kind of social media accounts doing geoscience activities, but it's really unclear as to how that actually relates to people then going on and getting into the subject. I would actually be really interested to see some data on how David Attenborough, for example, has actually influenced, you know, is there any way of actually correlating whether these high profile people do actually influence undergraduate intake? Because I think we assume that there is. But again, sometimes maybe we're not connecting the dots with actually evidence of the impact of those things.
That's nice. Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Sarah. Another theme that's kind of coming up in the questions quite a lot is how one can influence these perceptions or challenge these perceptions, and what sort of key work might there be to do, or whether there are any ideas from the panel or ideas coming up from the results of the survey about how, as a discipline, geoscience goes about challenging some of these perceptions. Are there any responses to that kind of query and line of questioning from the authors? Steve?
I mean, I think this is a really, really tricky question to answer. I think it's going to be different at different sort of stages of the geology world, if that makes, or different parts of the geology world. But from, say, for example, a university point of view, I think we can do a much better job of highlighting things like interdisciplinarity within our subjects, and highlighting things like the employability of geologists in things like open day materials and stuff like that, and even outreach materials that we do. So again, me and Natasha have obviously been out to schools doing outreach. We can change how we do outreach, for example, and highlight who is a geologist, what does a geologist do, to students at younger ages as well. But of course, it's very, very difficult. It's people doing lots of things in isolation a lot of the time in that stage. But I think from a university point of view, it's much more interdisciplinarity, and then sorting out EDI issues that are a big issue within the subject. And then it's up to other parts of geology to sort of, I suppose, just take on that responsibility and start, you know, we can talk about ideas and things like that, but I'm not in industry. I don't know what industry could do, for example, for that, whether it's support with outreach or support perhaps for equipment for students going on field work, whatever it might be. I don't know, you know, how that works, for example. But yeah, I think it's a difficult one to answer. It's different for everybody, probably.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Sarah's got a hand up as well. Sarah, if you want to.
I was going to say, it's all hands on deck, and whatever it is that Tasha or Steve or I or Raymat can do in our jobs, it's not going to be the same answer for you. So yes, and all hands on deck. And I hope you guys share the answers that you think of with each other in your field and collaborate on, you know, the next thing that you want to do. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Natasha, Raymat?
I was just going to add to what Sarah says. I think that for a long time, maybe geoscience as a whole was kind of burying its head in the sand a little bit about the extent of some of these issues. And I think a big part of dealing with this is actually just appreciating what the challenges are. And, you know, this kind of study, you know, we accept this isn't representative of the whole country, you know, but it is some of the first data that we have that's being presented in this way to show these kinds of perceptions. And I think that just knowing that these perceptions are out there and having these discussions within everyone's own individual contexts of what you can do locally with your local schools, or, you know, working in tandem with maybe universities in your region. I think from an industry perspective, showing diverse role models and showing diverse job and career pathways and showing people that there is really good employment in geoscience and sustainable employment is really important. But yeah, I think Sarah makes a really good point that it's about taking the understanding and then thinking about, you know, what can you do in your context to try and counter some of these views.
Thanks, Natasha. And Rema, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to draw on and build on what's already been said, but also there was a question in the chat about how we best bring in chemists and biologists. It is very much saying this is what's in your field and this is where it's transferable into geo, because that interdisciplinarity aspect, I know it came out in our survey, it's something for me personally, it's what makes it so exciting. And so it's definitely like bringing people in from those fields and saying this is super cool in your thing, in your field, bring it into geo, we can make it even more exciting. And being collaborative with all of this as well.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, part of the reason I ask, I think, is because we are all in this together, and the society's work is very much engaged in this kind of area as well. And so papers like this are really informative to the society and to the work that we're doing in terms of outreach. We're coming towards the end of our time. Natasha, you had your hand up. Did you have another comment to share? I was just going to make one more very brief comment, that I can see a few people naming people like Ian Stewart and Hayden Moore in the chat. And these are really great people within geoscience who are doing really important work. But I just wanted to flag this issue that we need to show more diverse role models. And it may be that you don't know people who would be great role models, but there is work going on to highlight and to kind of make more visible a whole range of geoscientists. So if you're interested, there's a project called Decolonizing Earth Science, which is working to create materials for educational institutions showing diverse figures in geoscience through history and at present day. There's also a shameless plug for the Geoscience of the Future website, which also has a lot of resources that are written, you know, articles written by geoscientists from really diverse backgrounds. So it's not to say that any of those people working in this field are not doing a great job, but it is really important to have diverse voices challenging these issues and working towards improving the situation. Thanks, Natasha. Rema, your hand's gone up again.
Yeah, just a very quick point. There are also lots of databases that highlight people from different demographic backgrounds, and so that everyone that adds their name into those, it's all self-identified data as well. So it's useful in that sense if you're trying to staff speakers in seminar series or if you're trying to do things more broadly.
That's great. We are now at time, so thank you everybody for your questions. I was just going to finish with one quick one about scope for a second survey of this kind, perhaps with an even wider scope. Is there any plans afoot from the authors to repeat this or to come back to this at some point in the future? Steve?
I would suggest a narrower scope is actually needed for any further work than this. This is a really good caption of just general public, if you like, general geologists and general non-geologists. I think if you want to actually answer a lot of the questions about who's coming into geology and why, you need to do a much narrower focused survey, and we'd love to do this. But as I said, we essentially did this for free. It wasn't funded by a research council or anything, and getting funding for this sort of work is incredibly difficult in the world of geology because it is completely different. It's, you know, it's qualitative work based on the discipline rather than a geological problem. So yes, we'd love to do loads more work, but how quickly we can get about doing it is very, very difficult to sort of answer. It's, you know, we've got jobs to do. So it's quite a tricky one.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Steve. And thanks to everybody again for coming along to the webinar today. I'd just like to say a final thank you to all of our speakers, to Catherine and Steve, Natasha, Sarah and Remat. The authors have very kindly said if there are any questions that weren't answered during the session, and there certainly are a lot of questions, that they will be available to follow up via email afterwards. So yeah, if you do have a question that we didn't unfortunately get to today, then please do feel free to follow up with the authors or with ourselves at the publishing house if it's something about ES3. But as I say, thank you very much to everybody involved today, particularly to the speakers, and we'll draw the webinar to a close there. Thanks, David. Thanks to our team.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone for coming.
Thank you.